Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite, or whatever the case may be. My name is Marcus, and I am the host of the Black Brazil Today YouTube channel, as well as the blackbraziltoday.com blog, where I analyze Brazil from the perspective of race. So today, I want to analyze an article that I put up, looks like about almost 4 years ago, December of 2018. And it addresses really an important topic when it comes to understanding the differences between how race plays out in Brazil versus how it plays out in the United States. This is an important discussion because, I've often pointed out how when I first started looking into the situation in Brazil, I was often, confused about why it is it could be such a wide range of how many people in Brazil were considered Black. When people ask me, and I get this question all the time, what made you start digging into Brazil? What got you interested in Brazil? It was because, I was already trying to understand. I had spent many years trying to understand the situation of African Americans and why it seemed that things never changed. Why did it seem like, so many areas where we go, whatever part of the country you might live in, it just seems like you cross a certain line in a particular city, and it seems like one side is, old, decrepit buildings, poverty, liquor stores everywhere, violence. And then you cross on another side, you see modern buildings, you see people doing pretty well. It's that division, for example, where I grew up in Detroit, in some ways it's we look at this division in some ways by an avenue, a main street in Detroit called 8 Mile. Some of you are probably familiar with it from, the Eminem film, of the same name. But I'm saying you can see this anywhere in all the cities that I've visited in the United States. I've noticed this difference where it just seems like you cross a certain line, and even if it's not an immediate shift, you just start seeing a slow, steady shift from one extreme to another. And this is something that's always fascinated me. Like, why, you know, when you grow up in the United States, you're taught, oh, Rosa Parks, she said no one day. She didn't give up her seat. Oh, Martin Luther King led marches across the country. Oh, Malcolm X taught us why we were taught to hate ourselves. Malcolm spoke out. He said things that a lot of civil rights leaders wouldn't say. You had the stories of people like Marcus Garvey. But after all of these prominent Black people and Black leaders, the situation in Black communities across the country continue to be, the life in African American communities is just not as it does not allow you to live as much of a full life as if you were living in a predominantly non-Black, suburban area where it's mostly like, non-Blacks live. And no matter how much I studied and dug into this topic, I couldn't understand what the difference was there. So, those answers started coming to me year by year, but by the time, the end of 1999 came around and I discovered this, you have this similar situation in Brazil. And I says, wow, how come I didn't know this? And generally with the African American population, you can generally understand how many African Americans live in the United States. But this same question wasn't quite easy in Brazil. And after I started digging into the reasons why, I started to understand like, oh, okay, well, it's really dependent much on people's self-identity as well as how these people are seen by other people. So once again, there are people in the United States, light-skinned persons of African descent who could easily go to Brazil and be considered white. Whereas some people in Brazil who have been living themselves and living in Brazil for all their lives and seeing themselves as white, when all of a sudden they catch a plane and end up in the United States, and all of a sudden they're not white. So this is a key point to understanding the differences yet similarities between Brazil and the United States. I saw so much of this over the years visiting different parts of Brazil. I'll never forget this one particular family I met on the interior of Bahia. And as I said, one part of the family was brown skinned. They were clearly African descendant, brown to dark skinned people. On the other side of the family, it was a family of mestiços, people of mixed race. Some of these people look very close to white. Like if they were to mix with one more white person, they would probably produce a very white looking baby. And I just remember one of the cousins in this family, she was fair skinned and she had like, greenish eyes or whatever. But I'm saying she didn't look much different than one of the cousins in my family, but yet she felt the need to tell me like, well, I'm the branquinho da familia. She's the little white girl of the family. Okay, that's how she saw herself. But I was just looking at her like, well, okay, maybe here, but in the United States, nobody will probably recognize you as white. So I could go on and on with that. The question between whiteness and mixedness or blackness in these two countries is something that will probably never be resolved. And in that same light, I've come to conclude that I don't think there's really any way you can actually just categorically say a certain number of black people live in Brazil. We'll say there's a large number, but some years ago, I had to start changing my own views on this question of blackness in Brazil because I was just running into too many people where it was somebody could look at this person and one person see them as white, another person see them as mixed, another person see them as black. And, I would see this all the time. And one of the main contradictions that made me start moving my own position on this race topic, because for years, I was under the belief from Afro-Brazilian activists, like any persons that's considered black or brown in Brazil are just part of the black population. But certain things that I started to see over the years started to make me, I had to make a shift in my opinion on this idea that all mixed people should be considered black. Because in reality, when you run into so many mixed people in Brazil, you cannot categorically just say all of them are black, because these same people who you want to define them as black just because, okay, they're mixed and they're of African ancestry. But if you ask someone like, okay, this light skinned mestizo, this light skinned woman with almost straight hair, with green eyes, a very fair skin, would you like to have this woman representing black women as like a beauty contest that's supposed to be representing black beauty? Would you want this woman to be would she be able to qualify for getting into the university through the affirmative action and quota system? That would be a question. Would people have a problem with that? And I've seen over the years that a lot of Black Brazilians have had a problem with this, where it took so long to get people to finally accept people of quote unquote mixed race as Black. But then when it comes to putting these resources on the table, people would, like, that person is not Black. What are you talking about? So I don't think Brazilians of African descent themselves have a clear view of how many Black people there are in Brazil, because, like, as I've said, just too many times you could take one person and two people looking at that same person would classify them differently. So this is the difference that we'll see between the United States and Brazil. So I want to get into this piece to expand on this topic a little bit more. Somebody wrote this really interesting piece. Again, it was from about 2018. And it asked the question, what's the difference in race between the United States and Brazil? Being mixed in the US is being closer to one's Black ancestry. In Brazil, being mestizo or mixed is being closer to one's white ancestry. Now, some people might disagree with that, and there's so many ways you could dissect this statement, and you could win either way, and regardless of which side of the fence you stand on this particular topic. So this picture on the left is something that, a lot of people, if you've looked at enough YouTube videos online, this picture has probably come up, where it's a description of how the painting represents the elite Brazilian dream of mixing Black people out of the population through continuous mixtures of Black people with lighter skin or white people. And then you have here a scene from the classic American film. I think it was called Imitation of Life. So let me just get into this article because it's intriguing. There's some things that came out in this article that I had an idea, but I wasn't absolutely sure. In fact, I one of these days I want to get in touch with the woman who wrote the article that I translated for this piece because it was really intriguing, something that she said. But before I get into that, these are my own views. I always introduce an article with my own thoughts before I get into the piece that I translated, right, from Portuguese to English. So the questions continue to be a hotly debated topic as more and more people become familiar with the racial politics of Brazil. Which country is more racist? A lot of people will ask, when we consider Brazil and the United States. What is the difference in terms of racial classification? Of course, I've come to my own conclusions about these questions, but I never tire of hearing the observations of others. Even as I've done much research on the issues of racism, racial identity classification, and race relations, I continue to come across little tidbits here and there that add another piece to the never ending puzzle. When I came across the piece below, it was literally a stop the press moment. Let me explain why. Both the United States and Brazil are countries that have similar histories of taking over the lands inhabited by Native Americans. Both used labor of enslaved Africans and both opened their doors to massive European immigration. In the Reconstruction era of the United States, strict laws of segregation were enacted in the American South. And while we don't find laws on the books in Brazil mandating segregation by law, segregation has been also documented in numerous cities while the country remained a non-segregationist image, at least on paper and in the imagination. But my question was the following. How is it that both the US and Brazil received European immigrants from places such as Germany and Italy, but while there was little racial mixture between men and women of different races in most parts of the US, in Brazil, miscegenation spread far and wide? Now, I want to just maybe alter that statement a little bit because we know that before the oncoming of Jim Crow laws in the United States for strict segregation, there was quite a bit of mixing going on in the United States as well. I just don't think it clearly wasn't on the level that you find in Brazil. But so many of us, this is what explains all of the different phenotypes we have in the African American community, from light, almost white, almost straight, almost blonde, blue and green eyes. You have people on that spectrum all the way up to people who look like they're pretty much unmixed Africans, right? The only way we can explain that is master's been in a slave house again, how, as Michelle Indigay-Ocella would say. How do we explain this if the same peoples, Germans and Italians, among others, went to both countries? Are we to believe that while these people went to the US and became staunchly anti-Black, the same people went to Brazil and freely mixed with descendants of African slaves? Well, first, let's be clear. Italians and Germans did bring their beliefs of racial superiority to Brazil. And we know this because, one, Brazil once had the largest Nazi party outside of Germany. And two, we have reports of the same views on the part of some Italian immigrants who often insulted, violently attacked, and even killed Black Brazilians. So what makes the two countries different in this regard? Well, Catarina Rocha's research came up with one intriguing detail of European immigration that I wasn't fully aware of. Yes, it is well known that the Brazilian government subsidized millions of European immigrants, paid their fare across the Atlantic, made attainment of employment easy, and even offered plots of land. But one detail, if it was a widespread practice, explains a key component to interracial relations and unions that I don't remember coming across. Read on. I'm sure you'll find it intriguing also. Last thing, as I started writing this intro, I wanted to find images that adequately represent the way race has played out in the two nations. So in Brazil, I used a painting that I've used numerous times in past posts called A Redenção de Ham, meaning the redemption of Ham, or Ham's redemption, from 1895 on the Brazilian side, and the 1934 American film Imitation of Life on the other side. The contrast and the meanings of the two are perfect for the analysis below. The painting, The Redemption of Ham, represents the Brazilian dream of the disappearance of the Black race through successive generations of racial mixture with whites. In the painting, the Black granddaughter, or rather the Black grandmother, thanks God for removing this quote unquote stain of Blackness from her family as her mixed race daughter holds her quote unquote white baby in her arms while her European immigrant husband proudly looks on. In imitation of life, a very fair skinned woman decides to try and pass as a white woman against her dark skinned black mother's wishes. Two very relevant backstories in the understanding of the two countries. So this is actually why I chose these two images, because the point here is in Brazil, everybody knows that most Brazilians have a little to a lot of African ancestry, right? And a person can very well identify themselves as white and nobody will say anything because, everyone will say, all of us have a little bit of African blood. If we were to just go by the United States identification of one drop makes everybody black, then almost the whole country would be considered black. So this is what makes Brazil different from the U.S. And a Brazilian, a person who seems to be have a majority of like white European ancestry, but with known African ancestry, they can still claim themselves as white, and nobody's going to dispute that. Of course, there are those cases where you have people, it'll come up in an argument or something like, well, we know you're not quite white. Even Brazilians will do that because most Brazilians, when they compare themselves to, say, American whites and European whites, they know that they look different from what American and European white people look like. On the other hand, in the United States, a woman would have to try to pass by distancing herself from her black ancestors, her black relatives, move across the country, adapt a whole new name, a whole new identity, and try to quote unquote pass. If she can distance herself from her black family and nobody knows her family history, then maybe people will accept her as white, because this thing of ancestry is what trumps all. You can look white, you can have blue eyes, blonde hair, very fair skin, but if people find that you have some very recent African ancestry and even distant African ancestry, people will look at you and say, well, you're not quite, you're not white, you belong in the black section. So two distinctively different ways that these two countries dealt with the race issue. One side says we're going to segregate non-whites from whites so that we keep, white purity, or, how they want to call it. On the other hand, the other country promoted mixing so that the black element of the population would eventually disappear. It never happened, but one could say this practice of whitening continues to go on to this day. So anyway, this piece is entitled Eugenics and Segregation in the U.S. and Brazil. It's by a woman named Catarina Rocha, and the introduction was by Pedro Borges. Pedro Borges is one of the founders of one of the websites that I most like that represent Black media in Brazil. Alma Preta, which means Black Soul. So this is a piece that comes off of the Alma Preta website, and like I said, there's just a couple things that came out that just kind of caught my attention. So let's just get into this. Catarina Rocha, author of Tons do Brasil, or Tones of Brazil project, and specialist in the theme of racial identification and colorism, wrote to the Alma Preta website about the process of eugenics in the country and in the U.S. That's another a topic I have to get into one day in the future. Brazil had its own, eugenics program that was going on. The whole idea, again, was to mix Black people out until they disappeared into this Brazilian whiteness, right? There's a lot of stuff that's been said about the eugenics movement in Brazil, in the 20th century, but that's not something I can take on right now. There's several articles that discuss that, but let's continue with this one for now. In the United States, debates about race served and still serve today as the basis for the Brazilian model of affirmative action. Brazil and the United States are very similar when we talk about racial issues, but the differences, besides being gigantic, are very important. In the U.S. censuses, the composition of the population by means of the classification of race is divided into two terms, whites and non-whites. That is, they opted for the binary classification. There, non-whites are not only characterized by Black people, but encompass all mestiços, fruits of any existing interracial combination. This difference occurs because racial segregation in the United States is stronger and more rigid than in Brazil. And the reason for this is a simple fact. In American society, the race of an individual is determined by ancestry. That is, in the US, mestiços, or people of mixed race, or pardos, meaning brown or mixed, they're considered black. And why are these concepts different in each country? The two countries have had distinct whitening laws through their history that have helped to construct the conflictive setting of Black identity in their respective nations. In short, the whitening is based on the concept of eugenics, which affirmed the superiority of the white race in relation to the other races. In the US, the concept of eugenics emerged in the 19th century and was implemented through a 20th century law that lasted into 1968. This law, recognized and called the one drop rule, was an anti miscegenation rule according to which any American who had some degree of African ancestry or any other non European was not considered white but a person of color and was forbidden to marry or have sex with the so called infamous superior race. In Brazil, eugenics was established through the Lei do Embranquecimento, meaning the whitening law, which also emerged in the late 19th century, but was created to encourage miscegenation. Here, this issue happened during the transition process of abolition and with the encouragement of European imperialism and of capitalism in the country. The plan of miscegenation in Brazil consisted in basically attracting immigrants with promises of land and guaranteed cheap labor to copulate with Blacks and Indians who lived there. According to the article, a diferença como prestígio, a representação social do branco no livro didático, which translated means difference as prestige, the social representation of the white in the didactic book, basically, school textbooks, by Ana Célia da Silva. The desire to transform Brazil with its hegemonically white ideal can be observed in the Brazilian immigration law instituted on June 8, 1890, which legally prevented the entry of Blacks and Asians into the country. The whitening law shows a very relevant historical point for the construction of a Brazilian racial discussion and the identity of the Brazilian people. In the book, O Genocídio do Negro Brasileiro, Processo do Racismo Mascarado, meaning the genocide of the Black Brazilian, process of a masked racism by well-known Afro-Brazilian historian, militant, intellectual Abdias do Nascimento. The author also talks about the whitening law already in the 20th century. According to him, on September 18, 1945, the president at the time, Getulio Vargas, signed Decree Law Number 7967, which regulated the entry of immigrants according to the need to preserve and develop in the ethnic composition of the population the most convenient characteristics of their African or of their European ancestry. Okay, in essence, what's going on here is that the president at the time created a law basically barring Asians and Africans from entering the country. The point here is that Brazil exploited more African labor than any other country in the Americas. And by this time, when this ideology of whitening the population came along, they just came to the conclusion, look, we have enough Black people here. We need to cut off African immigration here and then increase European immigration with the hopes of whitening the population, not only by the presence of millions of white bodies, but also through the promotion of mixing the races, right? So this is what this law is all about. Again, Brazil would tell you we never had any type of laws, racist laws. Like, well, what do you call this? You don't want any more Africans or Asians. They kind of loosened it up a little bit in terms of Asians, but that's a whole nother story. The decree required that possible immigrants personally present themselves to the council for the diplomat to see the candidate and report whether he was white, Black, or had any physical disability. At that time, the upper class of Brazilian society and many government men, including the former president, Getulio Vargas himself, believed that the problem of Brazilian development was related to the poor ethnic background of the people. It was believed that, quote unquote, good immigrants, white immigrants, when integrating with the non-white population, would cause Brazil to become a more developed society within 50 years. Now, this is a picture of the famed sociologist Gilberto Freire. He's one of the main formulators of Brazilian social thought and the idea of the racial democracy. His book it was translated as the master of and the slaves. Brazilian society adopted this book as its the basis of the mythology that says we don't have any race problems here. All the races get along here. We mix freely, and we don't have the racial problems that you have in other countries. This is the guy whose work is most credited with promoting that idea that Brazil didn't have any race problems. Of course, this idea has been thoroughly debunked over the last 70 years, 80 years or so. But some people still continue to believe, oh, we don't have race problems here, even with the glaring evidence. Um, Marina Afares, a 22-year-old student of scenic arts at the State University of Sao Paulo, has in her family an explicit case of the whitening law introduced during this period in Brazil. Despite having on her father's side a family with very little racial mixture of Black predominance and African descent, her mother's family is one of the most typical families with different ethnic groups scattered throughout the country. Her mother is a descendant of Indians, Blacks, and Italians, and now declares herself to be a mulher negra de pele clara, meaning a light-skinned Black woman. However, Marina says that as her mother, Hosanna, has a slightly lighter skin tone, very fine features, and a sharp nose, she grew up with the idea that her mother was a white woman and her father, homem negro retinto, being a very dark-skinned Black man. As it turns out, the perception of Hosanna, Marina's mother, changed over time, going from white woman to light-skinned Black woman. Marina says that her great-grandmother, that is, the mother of her grandmother's mother, was a case of extremely violent miscegenation. Indigenous, but with her African father enslaved, Marina's great-grandmother lived in her tribe throughout her childhood and adolescence. Marina tells how her grandmother was laçada, or kidnapped from her tribe away from her family to marry an Italian white man who was her great grandfather. The story the family knows is that the marriage worked as an exchange, and her Italian born grandfather hated being married and having children with a woman identified as non white. The exchange worked more or less like this. The condition for him to be able to immigrate to Brazil with a lot of land and a house was to marry a Black woman and reinforce the Brazilian miscegenation plan, Marina said. That is, in Brazil, the miscegenation began to be encouraged as a way of distancing the country from its Black and enslaved past. The X of the question, X obviously meaning the unknown, but this is something that really struck out. It stuck out to me because I've known that obviously the Brazilian government opened its doors to immigration of 4 to 5 million European immigrants with the idea of whitening the country and encouraging miscegenation. But what this girl is saying here is that in actuality, her grandmother, her Italian, I think it's her great grandfather, was giving all of these benefits upon the condition that he marry and procreate with a Black woman. That's something that I wasn't familiar with. Like the government actually not just promoted this idea of mixing, but actually, okay, look, if you want these benefits, you need to get with this Black woman. That's something that I didn't know. I only learned that from reading this article. It's really intriguing. I want to actually find some more information about this topic because that's very intriguing. If this is something that the Brazilian government was doing back in that time, then we can see that part of the reason for all of this mixing was going on is because the European immigrants wanted to take advantage of these benefits. One of the criteria for them to get these benefits was, marrying and having children with a Black woman. To me, that's like a game changer because it speaks so much about the desire to get rid of Black folks through mixing. It is necessary to understand a whole historical and conceptual process so that we can apply it to the present day. And even then, it is clear how in Brazil, race and color are confused. We have as proof famous cases such as the soccer players Neymar and Ronaldo, or singer Anitta, who have basically downplayed or straight out denied their Black ancestry, but are seen by each Brazilian in the way that is most convenient or fit a stereotype pattern of race. Now, this is intriguing. I don't know how many of you watching this video are familiar with soccer players like Neymar and Ronaldo, as well as the popular singer named Anitta. all of these people have in some ways uh just pissed off a lot of black folks with the way that they deal with the race question. Like Neymar, once upon a time, before he became a globally known superstar, when he was like 18, he says, "Well, I'm not really black." And when I looked at the interview, he actually said, "Eu não sou." I think he said, "Eu não sou preto." So in Neymar's mind, I didn't know what that meant. I'm saying, does that mean that he preto is generally considered to be persons of darker skin complexion? Neymar is he to me he's clearly black, but he's not dark skinned. So was he saying that he's not black as in the skin color, or he's not preto as to say he's not part of the black race? I was always confused about that. And people have called out Neymar for years for not speaking too much about racial issues, particularly with all of the racism Brazilian soccer players were experiencing in European football stadiums, right? Ronaldo, once upon a time, talking about racism, actually defined himself as white. It was, even his father looked at him like, that boy know he's black. And then Anita, she's what people have been defining as what's called conveniently black. There are articles I have on the blog that just show how this singer, first you take pictures of her before she became famous, and you clearly see, even being light skinned, you see some of her African ancestry, in her facial features. But people accused her of presenting herself as whiter when she's like outside of the country, in the United States or Europe somewhere, making herself look as white as possible. But when she comes back to Brazil and she wants to record videos in the favelas, the slums of Brazil, then she'll take on these black attributes. You know, she'll put braids in her hair, and she says, "Yeah, well, I always felt I was a little bit neguinho, always a little bit neguinho." Again, this diminutive term about of blackness that I covered, in one of my previous videos. Like some people see it as an insult, this neguinho word. Other people see it as a term of affection. But the point is, these three well-known Brazilians are just famous for either skirting the race issue altogether or just not clearly stating that they are black. Now some people could say, "Hey, that's their right," and I agree, that is actually their right. But at the same time, when you look at people who look like them, and there are millions of Brazilians who look like them, if they identify with these people who deny being black, then what is that going to say about how people who look like them would define themselves as well? Anyway, of course, these evaluations will take a different turn when one considers different regionalities, different social classes, different families and creations, and even different sex and sexual orientations. And when you yourself don't know what you are, and when others try to tell you, and it changes with each new opinion, that's where everything gets more complex. And this is something that I've said. I said earlier in this video, a person who's confused about what race they belong to, and you have one person say, "Ah, you're white," and another person says, "Oh, they're no, you're black. You belong on this side." How does that person develop that identity when they constantly feel stuck in the middle? So I'll say that in the particularly last 10 years or so, these identity politics have done nothing but grow in Brazil. And I still don't think there's a clear answer to how many black people actually live in Brazil. It's impossible to say, because what might be black for me might be white for you. Who's judging? Basically what my question would be. And this is the point. And what's the point of all of this? There is an obvious conclusion to this discussion. To be mestiço, or person of mixed race in the US, is to be closer to one's black ancestry. And to be mestiço in Brazil is to be closer to one's white ancestry. I don't know. I'm not so sure about that. I mean, obviously everybody, has their right to an opinion. But I think it really, to me, every mestiço or person of mixed race is not the same. This is one of the issues that I have with bunching all so-called mestizos or pardos in the same group. I mean, what happens if you have a person who's mixed, say white and Japanese? That mixture is going to be different from, say, a person who's mixed black with Native American heritage, for example. I don't necessarily agree with this, because what I'm saying is a lot of what we call mestiços suffer a certain type of racism themselves. A lot of people would argue is not as blatant as what clearly black and brown skinned people experience, but nonetheless, when you look at the social economic statistics, you see that persons who are brown, mixed, or whatever, their quality of life is almost identical to that of quote unquote black people, and definitely at a disadvantage compared to the white people or people who consider themselves white, Brazilian white, or almost white in Brazil. It's fairly clear. So even though it is to a certain degree, you could say that the mestizo is closer to white because everybody wants to get away from being dark skinned or brown skinned. But you could actually say, in some ways, what she's saying is true because so many people want to escape out of that non-white category and move into the white category. And they'll say, well, at least you're not as black as those dark skinned people. So in some ways, what she's saying is true. Is I just believe that there are certain levels of mestizos, people of mixed race. Some of them lean towards more the black side. Some of them look almost white, and then you got some who are just definitively in the middle, and you can't really decide. So I understand what the point she's making here, even though I can't completely agree with it, but I do understand it is valid to a certain degree. Therefore, it is more understandable why there is so much complexity in trying to define the racial classification of the Pardo, the brown person, the person of, mixed ancestry, whether they be of African ancestry or whatever. The classification of Pardos is directly related to miscegenation and to the issue of embranquecimento of or not of a population. So, I got a lot out of what she was talking about in this piece, particularly the idea that her, what was it, great grandfather, the Italian, was given this deal. Like, you can get land and we'll help you get started in this new country, your new home, if you follow the criteria that's requested, including, marrying and procreating with a black woman. That's something that I want to follow up more on because this is a woman who told this story about her own family. So I'm just wondering, wow, I knew about the immigration part to attract Europeans there, but actually to say individually to a person, look, I need you to marry a black woman and have kids with her. It's like that's something that I wasn't familiar with. So with that said, I'm gonna end this video here. And again, did you I definitely learned something from this article. If this was a thought-provoking article to you or video, definitely leave your comments in the comment section. I'm curious to know what people thought about this article, this video. If you like this video or others that on the channel, feel free, definitely subscribe to the channel. Share this video with people because a lot of people, the race topic is something that's never going to go away. Some people, I think one of the things that I'm bringing to the table is that, a lot of African Americans are obviously familiar with the issue of race in the US, but maybe people don't know how much more complicated and complex it can be when compared to the situation in Brazil. Also, do definitely smash that notification button. That way you'll get notifications when I put up new videos. And like I said, hope to keep them coming. So hopefully with the next video, I'll see you guys come back and check it out. So until then, I'll catch you next time.